I love a good courtroom drama. I like watching lawyers work within the established legal framework in order to make a case for a particular position using whatever evidence is available.
Well then, Braxton, you're in luck, as it's time to brew up a courtroom drama, with you being the defense and I the prosecution. Let's see if we can win over the jurors, shall we? Why, hello my fellow apes, I hope you're well. Just over a month ago, Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio published a video of yours truly in the thumbnail, and a caption saying, "I can't be the only one noticing this." The title of the video is Why Atheist Debunking Video Shouldn't Worry You at All, and as it stands, it's one of his most highly viewed as of late. Now, I must admit that this is going to be a bit of a difficult one to respond to, since the analogy Braxton gives is, well, problematic. But I still think it's worthwhile responding, if only to challenge his rhetoric and framing. So let's get this trial started.
I love a good courtroom drama. I like watching lawyers work within the established legal framework in order to make a case for a particular position using whatever evidence is available. And even though fiction makes it seem much more common than it really is, occasionally someone who actually did commit a crime will go free because of some technicality related to legal procedure.
Alright, so when it comes to argumentation, analogical reasoning has a vexed reputation. Consider the most famous or infamous theological use of analogical reasoning, William Paley's watchmaker analogy. The argument draws an analogy between a pocket watch and biology, as can be represented by, say, the human eye, and reasons that just as we know the pocket watch, by virtue of its complexity, had a creator, so too we can know that the eye, by virtue of its complexity, had a creator. Variants of this analogy convinced a lot of people of theism for a very long time, and yet when Darwin published The Origin of Species, and in doing so revolutionized the world to evolution by natural selection, it instantly became obvious that Paley's analogy is bogus. But as hesitant as I am, let's continue.
And in such a case, the person might not receive the verdict guilty, but everyone involved not only knows that they likely are guilty, but knows a lot of the relevant details about how they committed the crime, and they know this because of the weight of evidence in the case. In other words, what individual people can clearly see as true or have strong justification for believing isn't necessarily the same thing as establishing that legally.
So Braxton is setting up a scenario here in which we all know that someone is guilty of a crime, but how we know and to what degree of certainty he doesn't say. Further still, he doesn't specify the type of technicality, and so his entire analogy is extremely vague, meaning that it's going to be very difficult to draw a correspondence between his analogy and whatever theological scenario he's about to lay out.
But what if we thought about the case for God's existence, not in terms of a legal case, but in terms of the tight syllogistic argumentation in the field of philosophy of religion? Just as it's possible the evidence in some legal case could demonstrate that a person did a particular thing, but the case might not go through because of some procedural mistake, philosophical arguments for God's existence often give very good reason to believe that God exists, even though some aspect of the argument could not seem to be conclusive, though still very, very likely.
Well, is it a technicality or a procedural mistake, as they're very different things? This vastly changes the analogy.
But the case might not go through because of some procedural mistake.
But in any case, and to reiterate, without a tangible example of someone escaping the justice system due to a specific technicality, or indeed procedural mistake, it's pretty much impossible to draw a correspondence here. Now I could, of course, provide such an example, but in doing so I might not capture the analogy as Braxton intended, and so I won't. Unfortunately, we're just going to have to proceed with this very, very vague analogy.
But perhaps you as an individual see the force of these arguments, but there's some extremely technical objection that you don't know how to answer.
Extremely technical. I mean, some objections are technical, sure, but others are not, such as Darwin's natural selection. This objection is pretty easy to get one's head around, so much so in fact that as of today the majority of Christians, no less, accept natural selection, and thus have discarded Paley's watchmaker analogy altogether. What's more, the fact that some objections are technical is really quite irrelevant to whether or not they successfully undercut or rebut an argument. The specific orbits of the planets are technical, and yet they prove to be a very serious objection to Newtonian mechanics. So I'm not really a fan of Braxton's framing here, since he's at least implicitly painting all objections as extremely technical, and they're not.
Just as with the court case, you may come to think that some particular aspect of the argument has some sort of weakness. But that doesn't mean that you as an individual can't still see the force of the argument in general. Let's look at an example. Take contingency arguments. Reality has things that are contingent and require an explanation from outside of themselves. A reality also has at least one thing that is necessary and requires nothing outside of itself for existence.
Now, I appreciate that Braxton is just laying out the argument here, but the proposition of a necessary being is actually very contentious. While it's true that some philosophers, and especially theists, maintain that there is at least one necessary being, many philosophers don't, including some prominent theists, such as Richard Swinburne. Bertrand Russell, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, Stephen Hawking, and Sean Carroll, to name just a few other prominent thinkers, found and find the proposition of necessary beings ludicrous. Now, if these philosophers and scientists are correct in their assessment, then contingency arguments completely fall apart, since they insist on a necessary being. And so again, contention over the existence of a necessary being isn't just some technicality. No, it's half the damn case.
One challenge that's brought to arguments like this is to say, perhaps things don't require that sort of explanation. Now, since this sort of a principle undergirds our scientific work and actually is evidenced by 100% of our experience of the world, and chanting quantum mechanics here doesn't really help because, number one, you'd be making the point of this video, and number two, atheists actually need to do quite a bit more work to make that a relevant objection. Now, in such a case, perhaps an individual finds it difficult to uphold this notion philosophically, but that doesn't mean they can't see the force of the argument.
So it seems that Braxton isn't really aware of the objection he's touching upon, or at the very least, he didn't articulate it very well. So let me, or better yet, let Carroll. In the Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Physics, Carroll writes the following. The naturalness of the impulse to ask why the universe exists does not imply that the question is coherent or answerable. It might be the case that the property of having a reason why applies to facts within reality, but not to all of reality itself. Our experience of the world, which is confined to an extraordinarily tiny fraction of reality, doesn't leave us well equipped to think in appropriate ways about the question of its existence. Carroll's words here express the same sentiment that Bertrand Russell did in his debate with Frederick Cobblestone, which was on the contingency argument no less. In short, yes, when we look around us, we see that everything in the universe is contingent, that everything is predicated on something else, that everything is explained in terms of other things. For instance, I'm making this response primarily because Braxton stuck my mug on the thumbnail of his video. And, by the way, thank you for the compliment, Brax. But even if it were the case that absolutely everything within the universe is contingent, it would in no way follow that the universe itself is contingent, just as it doesn't follow, to use Russell's example, that the human race as a whole has a mother because every individual human has a mother. This is a fallacy of composition. And again, this isn't just some extremely technical objection or just a pinhole in the fabric of the argument. No, it's a very serious flaw in the case, since if we don't have sufficient reason to confidently state that the universe is a contingent being, then the argument from contingency is pretty much bankrupt. We can just say that either the universe is a necessary being, or indeed, the universe is a brute fact.
Or take the Kalam cosmological argument, which famously says everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause for its existence. And then we reason further that that cause must be God. In defense of premise 2, that the universe began to exist, proponents of the argument might try to demonstrate this by showing the impossibility of a past infinite series of causal events or temporal moments. I've offered this in nuanced ways all over this channel. But perhaps you just can't shake the idea in your mind that though it seems extremely unlikely, maybe there's a non-zero chance that the universe is past infinite.
Honestly, I find this confidence quite frankly repulsive. There is currently a multiplicity of contending models of the universe, with many positing an infinite past, and while physicists and philosophers have their favourites, I don't think I've ever seen one ooze as much confidence as Braxton here, with the exception, of course, of the odd philosopher who also happens to be an apologist.
Hilbert's Hotel is absurd.
If you're right, it could show that people in the philosophy of religion need to spend more time working on the argument to make it as tight as they can possibly make it.
Or possibly it could mean that the argument isn't very good, couldn't it? You know, that we've made progress by making some new observations or establishing new theories. Natural selection is a good example here, but since we're on the Kalam, consider Al-Ghazali's argument that we know that the universe had a beginning, since if the solar system had existed forever, then it would follow that Saturn has made as many orbits as Earth, despite the former taking 29 times as long as the latter to do so. For many, this conclusion is unintuitive, but Georg Cantor's set theory blew this argument, along with many other Kalam arguments, out of the water. As it turns out, there are in fact different sizes of infinite. There's no contradiction in drawing a one-to-one correspondence between the natural numbers and a subset of the natural numbers. Now, sure, some still champion Al-Ghazali's argument, such as William Lane Craig, but to fail to see the force of this objection and merely conclude that philosophers, and let's be honest, you mean theologians, just need to dot the I's and cross the T's, strikes me as
absurd.
Objections like these are actually helpful and fun to talk about because they help us to tighten up the argument as much as possible or to get rid of certain defenses.
Or maybe get rid of the argument itself, right? I mean, I think it's fair to assume that Braxton doesn't buy every argument for God's existence. Surely he recognizes that some of the objections have indeed ended the debate.
But as an individual, you can still look at the weight of the case and see the strength in it. If people think contingency arguments can be dismissed because they doubt PSRs, or that the universe is past infinite despite that seeming to result in absurdities, I can only advise that such a person step back from the arguments and recognize the difference between the work of a philosopher to shore up every defense and make it as tight as they can, and an individual's ability to see where the evidence lies.
Okay, so there's a lot to address here, and so let's go through it again, one step at a time.
If people think contingency arguments can be dismissed because they doubt PSRs,
well, they can, can't they? If one isn't convinced that everything must have an explanation, then contingency arguments do indeed fall apart.
or that the universe is past infinite despite that seeming to result in absurdities.
If by an absurdity we mean something that is unintuitive, such as that there are different sizes of infinite, then this just isn't a problem. General relativity, electromagnetism, and quantum mechanics are unintuitive, but this is in no way reason to doubt the force of their explanatory value. And if by absurdity we mean something that is contradictory, then isn't this one of the crucial premises that the proponent of the Kalam is attempting to demonstrate? I mean, if we're not convinced by any of the arguments, then trivially we're just going to deny that assuming an infinite past results in a contradiction.
I can only advise that such a person step back from the arguments and recognize the difference between the work of a philosopher to shore up every defense and make it as tight as they can, and an individual's ability to see where the evidence lies.
Notice that Braxton frames those that defend theological arguments as philosophers and those that issue objections as ordinary individuals. But this, ironically, is pretty much the opposite. The vast majority of philosophers are atheists. Indeed, the people that most thoroughly study the fabric of what is supposedly God's world are less likely to believe in God than the average Joe.
To nutshell what I'm basically saying, these arguments have stood the test of time. And occasionally an objection comes that is what I have in the past referred to as a pinhole sort of objection. Something that is extremely unlikely, but still has a non-zero possibility of being true. It doesn't mean that we should throw out the argument on the basis of this extremely unlikely thing. And if you are the person who is wiggling out of the strength of the argument through a pinhole, you might consider why that's the case.
Again, the framing here is quite frustrating. Could it not be, Braxton, that greater minds than we both have considered these arguments, and yet they, predominantly philosophers and scientists, have come to the conclusion that these arguments are not sound? Why paint them as merely individuals who are just trying to wiggle out of a pinhole? What are you trying to achieve here? Are you just trying to reassure your flock? Because while I normally don't have a bone to pick with you, I do here. Please, my dude, cease with this loaded language and stop implicitly portraying those that don't agree with you as disingenuous.
I'm not annoyed by these objections. I find them helpful. Philosophers need to tease out all the problems with certain defenses of certain arguments to make the arguments and the defenses of their premises as strong as they possibly can. But that's a separate issue from what you are doing as an individual to see the truth as it is represented through the arguments.
Yeah, but it's not. Philosophers, and more accurately theologians, are, to continue with the court analogy, the defence, and we are the jurors. If it happens to be the case, and indeed it is, that the most educated among us find the defence's case unconvincing, then maybe, just maybe, there's more than technical issues and procedural mistakes. To return to the title of Braxton's video, should theists be worried about atheist debunking videos? Well, if you have a faith like Braxton, then probably not. I'm actually somewhat astonished by his confidence in, for instance, it being extremely unlikely that the universe is past infinite. Given our current epistemic state, given our scientific understanding, I'd honestly raise an eyebrow at anyone who's extremely confident on any view related to this proposition. But putting this aside, I can tell you this. Over the years, I've had countless emails from people kindly letting me know that my videos have helped them recognise the flaws in theistic arguments, and that they have consequently ceased endorsing them. And I know that my atheist colleagues here on YouTube have had similar experiences. Add to this the demonstrable growth of atheism over the last century, and I think it's really quite obvious that debunking efforts, be it on YouTube or elsewhere, is certainly something apologists should be worried about. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and YouTube members. If you're a fan of the channel and want to help keep the lights on, then please do check out Patreon and YouTube members, as it really does help, and especially so during times when views are low, such as it is at the moment. Much love all.